Howdy, y'all. So I'm Zofia Rybkowski, as you heard, and I'm going to talk to you about the luminous power of serious games and simulations. When is the last time you changed your mind about something you deeply believed? Well, this happened to me, and I'm going to relate to you a story, because I think it's something that certainly changed my life, and it might be something you want to think about with your own. What happened to give you that light bulb moment? So a number of years ago, I was a college student, like many of you in the audience, went backpacking across Europe, and did not have a whole lot of money, just like many college students, decided to spend the night at a youth hostel in a little border town in Europe. And we walked into this youth hostel. First thing I noticed is it did not smell so good. But, you know, you figure, well, it's not very expensive, we're glad to be here. Okay, walked in, looked to the left, and there were these kind of dented, gray, scratched up lockers. You know what kind they are. A lot of high schools have them, right? And then turned right, and then left again, then walked into the bedroom. Bedrooms were bunk beds. There were these sort of metal gray bunk beds, horsehair mattresses that sort of swayed and sagged. And the window had bars on it. Kind of mean, not a whole lot of light. And the glass was smudged. Well, my friend and I said, so be it. We're lucky to have a place to spend the night. Let's go see Europe. We're here to see the great monuments of Europe after all. So we did. Went away, came back. The next morning, we were grateful to have breakfast. They gave us free breakfast. And there were several other voyagers there. But we all ate quickly, and we left quickly. We got on the train and headed for Salzburg, Austria, and knew we were going to check into another youth hostel, and fully expected the exact same thing to happen. We just had a few dollars in our pockets. Okay, we'll go stay at one of these places. The amazing thing is, I walked into the space, and I was stunned. First of all, the smell was very different. It smelled clean. And I saw an aerial walkway, and then a fellow voyager down below, and they were talking to each other in a very animated fashion. And then I turned to the left, and I walked into this room that just exploded with light and voices and the din of excited travelers meeting each other. And then I turned to the right, and there were all these colorful lockers. And I walked a little further, and I went into the bedroom, and the bunk beds were nice and solid. And the windows, they brought in beautiful daylight. The thing that struck me is how many people stayed, and they exchanged stories, and they shared information about their travels with one another. And at that moment, I had a light bulb moment. A light bulb moment. It was interesting that something like a space could change people's behavior. So is it possible to improve the quality of space while reducing cost using a method called lean integrated project delivery? Now you're probably thinking, that's kind of a jump, going from this little story to lean integrated project delivery. Well, the reason why I'm making this transition is that originally I was studying to be a bench scientist, a biologist. And I was so moved by that one experience, that light bulb moment, that I decided to go off and study architecture. And I eventually went off and did a PhD, and I was determined to figure out how to make beautiful spaces that did not cost a whole lot. So I did my PhD at UC Berkeley, and what I studied with lean integrated project delivery. So lean integrated project delivery is a way of delivering projects that reduced waste and add value, but basically they make a building, it's possible to make a building at lower cost. Because you see, in our industry, whenever you build a building and you have owners and architects and engineers and contractors, costs often escalate. And it usually takes a lot longer than we expected. But this group of people had figured out how to make buildings that were beautiful, that could actually be relatively reasonable and affordable. But because I was a bench scientist, I was skeptical. So how could I feel confident that these claims that they were making were true? How many of you in this audience have a background in the sciences? A few people. Good. So you might be familiar with this thing called randomized controlled trials. For those of you who don't have a background in the sciences, I'll just give you a really brief introduction to this. Stay with me. Okay, you have a researcher. The researcher is trying to figure out very specifically if this pill has an active ingredient that will reduce stress. Okay, so you find a population of people and you give them this pill. But is that good enough? Well, it's not good enough because you don't know if they're feeling better and less stressed because they've taken this pill or because they think that they're feeling less stressed because they've taken the pill. So you need a control group. And this is called a placebo, and it doesn't have the active ingredient. But the people can't know that they have a placebo, so you have to make it look the same. And in fact, the researcher also cannot know who has the active ingredient and who does not, right? It's called a double-blind experiment, and we call this the gold standard of research, of medical trials, is a randomized controlled trial. So I had been trained in this world as a bench scientist, and I wanted to see if we could do this in management. So I was very excited to discover something called serious games and simulations. They kind of have a before and after scenario. They sort of have a benchmark, and they have one contrasting variable or intervention, and they're fun to play. So they're actually a lot more fun than a randomized controlled trial, I can tell you that, okay? Round one, benchmark the current situation. You play systematically, and you collect metrics. That means you collect data, so scientists can be, convinced. Round two, you play it again, but you make one change. We say you make a single intervention, and you collect the same metrics. And you make this available for everybody to see. And you ask, what is the impact of that one intervention? And then they have a light bulb moment, okay? Well, that's certainly what happened with me when I started playing these games. So not only did I start playing the games, I started challenging my students to help me design new games. So this is a game that was developed by some students of mine several years ago called Collective Kaizen and Standardization. So Kaizen basically means continuous improvement. And these games are meant to sort of look at business as usual. And again, I told you that in one of our frustrating moments that we have in my field is that there's a tendency to find people who are not particularly competent or good at something, and so what do? You just fire them. Well, Lean believes that basically with every pair of hands comes a free brain, and that there's a basic assumption that most people want to learn, okay? They want to do better. So this game is sort of to prove that, or see if that actually is true. Okay, how to improve your team's performance in less than 50 minutes with the employees you have now. So I'm going to go through this with you. So this originally came from a publication in 1914 by this amazing industrial psychologist named Lillian Gilbreth. If you ever hear about a book called Cheaper by the Dozen, or film Cheaper by the Dozen, the original one, actually. Lillian Gilbreth had 12 children, and she wrote a book called The Psychology of Management. She was the first industrial psychologist, and this is what she writes. The manager notices some particularly successful man or method or arrangement of tools, equipment, and surroundings and decides to have a record made thereof that the success may be repeated. These records, if made in sufficient detail, are very valuable. But she also talks about mentioning the names of men who have offered valuable suggestions or inventions. They make the worker feel his part in successful results. Okay, let's see if this works. So the students were tasked with figuring out a simulation that could actually test this and then try to share this with other people. So they came up with this game where participants are asked to make a paper plane and fly it as far and as straight as they can. And there's a little bit of prep time. You have to put little marks on the floor every 5 feet and see who is the person who can make the plane go the farthest and the straightest. And then that person is going to teach everybody else. So let's watch.
Now we need to take these points and place it in the center line. From the opposite side, we need to take the triangles to the center line.
Good job. All right, so obviously we had a lot of fun in these classes. So BB is the one there who's teaching everybody, right? So it's kind of cool because you can see here in the first round there's a lot of creativity, which is really great. But again, it's very clear what the mission is. You got to make the plane fly as far and as straight as you can. Q, up there, right? This is going to be the winning plane. And that person now teaches everybody else, okay? So let's see how they did. First round, the pre-round, on average, the mean over there is 6.8 feet. Post-round, 22.7 feet. Improvement, 15.9 feet. If you're visual, kind of a visual learner or process data that way, you can see right here in the pre-round, this is how they did. And in the post-round, where they were taught by this first-rate performer, you can see how they did. That's pretty amazing. That's a 237% improvement based on the median performance in 50 minutes. And nobody was fired. So the basic concept of Kaizen, or continuous improvement, is that you sort of benchmark your current state, you do an experiment, you standardize, and once you standardize, you try it again. And so you can continually improve, which is really kind of cool because it's a wonderful map or roadmap for a company to take. And again, where every pair of hands has a free brain and is part of the process of continuous improvement. So if you're going to facilitate these games, you've got to have some sort of engagement, right, with the people and make sure that some of their hurdles that they might have in terms of adopting this attitude are addressed, right? So for example, if you're not a first-rate performer, what might motivate you to adopt methods used by first-rate performers? And if you are a first-rate performer, what might motivate you to share your secret expertise with others in your organization? And these are really legitimate questions for those of us who have worked for a while, right? So there are other games out there. This is by Visionary Products. That's the company that makes it. But basically, they address some mathematical equations that are a little bit frustrating if you just look at them. Like, for example, things like throughput, right, cycle time, flow, all these things that people in management have to learn. But until you play the game, don't make too much sense. And once you play the game, they make perfect sense. And again, you start with one situation and you add an intervention and you see the impact by collecting metrics. one, which is very interesting, called the Parade of Trades, or the dice game, was developed by Greg Howell and Iris Tomaline. And they're some of the founders in the Lean Integrated Project community. And the impact of variability and how that actually will make a project take longer than expected. This game was developed, so it was inspired, I should say, by a TED Talk that came out a number of years ago by Tom Wujek, who was actually reporting on some work by Peter Skillman. But it was my graduate student, Manish Munakami, who actually took the game and turned it into a costing game, an estimating game. And it was, again, with basically to make a tower as 2 feet tall, no more than 2 inches out of plumb, freestanding. And you do the first round where they don't know the cost, and the second round where they do. And they can get a light bulb moment from that, which is really kind of cool. We've shared this game around the world. It's being played in Germany and Hong Kong and Ireland and all sorts of places. This place, Dr. Ganesh Devkar from Ahmedabad in India sent me photographs from after I sent him the game. And the neat thing is they didn't have marshmallows, but they did have cheese. Okay, quick review. Okay, first step, what do you have to do? Benchmark the current situation. Were you going to say that? Yeah. Good. And then what do you have to do? Good. Introduce an intervention. And then you ask, what is the impact of that intervention? And that's when people get the light bulb moment. One thing I want to tell you that's kind of cool about these games when you develop them, they take really complicated, very expensive equipment to develop. Like this little treasure chest I have here. Paper, marker, straws, masking tape, measuring tape, Post-it notes, marshmallows, okay? So you get the picture, right? It doesn't take an awful lot to develop a simulation. And we go into historical records of some of the great management consultants. If you ever want to know more about that in the history of that, I'd be more than happy to talk to you about that. But this was incredible because these were light bulb moments in my life. And interestingly, they create light bulb moments in others' lives as well. It's changing our profession. Okay, one caveat. It's really important that you own the idea. So, the person who plays the game, if you're going to facilitate a game like this, never tell them in advance what they're going to learn. I mean, I shared a lot of stuff with you right now, right? But if you do this in a setting with a company or a classroom setting, because you see, if you remember going all the way back to my backpacking trip across Europe, a couple things, you know, my father had been an architect. And I, again, was always skeptical, being a bench scientist that I was. I just thought, oh, it's all subjective and this sort of stuff, right? But it wasn't until I experienced that light bulb moment myself that I owned the idea and that I changed my mind. And that's an idea worth spreading. Thank you.